have your Bibles, find Acts chapter 1. Acts chapter 1, Ecclesiastes chapter 4, 1 Peter chapter 5, and Hebrews chapter 13. Acts chapter 1, Ecclesiastes chapter 4, 1 Peter chapter 5, Hebrews chapter 13. We started a couple of weeks ago going through the book of Acts. I don't know how far we'll get, because it would take me a long time to get through the whole book. So we likely will not do that. But we will go for a while. And we started, I think it was 2 weeks ago. We made it through 11 verses. And in those first 11 verses, we saw that Jesus had spent his last moments on earth with his apostles, giving them a little bit of instruction, mostly to wait, and then he just disappeared into the clouds. And what he left behind on this earth was about 120 believers, 120 followers. And 120, it can seem like a lot when you're all packed into one room. But in comparison to the population in Palestine, the Jewish population in Palestine at that time, it was just a very small number. The estimated population during that time was about 4 million people. And so 120 believers, it would seem like, not a lot of impact had been made. If you use that same ratio today, there's 10.5 million people that live in North Carolina. If you did the same exact ratio today, that would mean about 315 believers living in North Carolina today. But we know that that's not the truth. We know that there are a lot more believers in North Carolina today. As a matter of fact, there are 2 billion people who identify themselves worldwide as Christians. Whether that is a true number or not, I, of course, have no way of knowing. That would be about 1/3 of our population. But the book of Acts is the story of how all that took place, how the world began to hear about Jesus and how the church became the church. It's one of the most amazing stories ever recorded in human history. It is the story of how the church impacted the world and changed the world, and it's the story that continues today. It all really began in this 10-day period between the ascension of Jesus and the coming of the Holy Spirit. Those 120 people that were left here on earth by Jesus, they are living in this 10-day period, and they didn't know exactly how many days it would be, but they're living in what was in between, the in-between life. And in-between is really difficult to live. When you are living in between jobs. Now, that's so very uncomfortable. If you're living in between houses, that's an uncomfortable thing. When you are, for some people, when you're in between relationships, that's just a difficult time. In between medical appointments, that's a very hard time. In between pastors, that's not always so easy. In between is not where most of us want to live, because in between means uncertainty. And so it's just uncomfortable. And that's how it was for these followers of Jesus. They were told to wait. And so they're living in this in-between time waiting. Jesus is gone. They can no longer talk to him face to face. They can't touch him. They can't hug him. They miss him. It's in between. It's waiting. Now, you who have been Christians for a long time, you know that waiting and faith, that goes hand in hand. And if you do the first without the second, that if you wait and you wait without faith, if you wait and you jump ahead and you start doing things yourself, that usually ends in chaos. But if you can learn to wait with faith, then you will discover that God's blessings come. So here they were kind of living this life of waiting and in between, not sure of what's going to happen, but they were waiting with faith, and they were just waiting for the opportunity to do something for God. And so here we are, back in Acts chapter 1 this morning. The apostles are waiting, everybody is waiting, and for most of them right now, this little waiting period, it was a good thing. For the apostles, the last 6 weeks have been a nightmare. I mean, they were probably exhausted from all that had taken place. Jesus had been arrested, he was put on trial, he was executed, crucified in front of the whole world, and then that powerful resurrection, their hope is alive again, and then he leaves them once again as he ascends into the clouds. They're overwhelmed by all of this. Everything they had seen and heard and felt, it's all those emotions, and you can imagine that probably their energy is just gone. It's just been sucked out of their bodies. And so they're tired, and they're anxious, and now they're waiting. They are in between. So Acts chapter 1, verse 12, it says this. Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, that's the Mount of Olives, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey. Now for them, a Sabbath day journey meant maybe a half a mile, 3/4 of a mile, but it would definitely be under a mile, and it was the maximum that a Jew was allowed to travel on the Sabbath without breaking the not allowed to work on the Sabbath day commandment. So somewhere between a half and 3/4 of a mile they were allowed to walk. Verse 13, and when they had entered this house that they were at, when they had entered, they went up into the upper room where they were staying. So here they are, they walk about 3/4 of a mile or so from the Mount of Olives to someone's house in Jerusalem. And it's a room with an upstairs. The upstairs in these houses back then would usually be the largest room. This room was able to accommodate 120 people, which tells us it was a pretty large house. It was very unusual in this day. It was probably owned by a wealthy man or a wealthy family, but it was big enough so they could get 120 people in the upper room. But the whole point is, here they are in between. The events of life have just gone. It just seems absolutely crazy. It would have just been so easy for them to go, I'm going home. Just scatter here and there and everywhere. But the point is, they didn't. They stuck together. And that is a great point for us to learn today. They didn't give up, because Christians are always at their best when they stick together. We are always at our best when we come together, stick together for the same cause, which is Jesus. And when we all have the same cause, Jesus, it's much easier for us to stick together. When we all come together for Jesus, it makes difficult times better. I just had a blast at Vacation Bible School this week. From the very first day, because this is what happens in Vacation Bible School. Things happen that you don't think will happen. maybe a lot more people come than you're hoping for, and they're scrambling. You know, it is a group of people in a moment for the cause of Jesus coming together and making it work. It's a beautiful thing because that's what we do. We stick together. And so for these followers of Jesus, they were living in some challenging times, and they stuck together. I mean, they just stuck together with one another. That is a very important thing for Christians to do, to stick together. You are always better together than you are alone. Let me show that to you. It's Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Ecclesiastes is one of those wisdom books in the Old Testament. And he's going to give us a great word of wisdom this morning, a great word for us to remember. As a matter of fact, you probably know this word very well. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, I'll begin reading in verse 9. It says this, 2 are better than 1. And that is so very, very true. About a year ago, and I think most of you probably know this by now because I talk about it way too much, but about a year ago, Cindy and I were building a house. We had bought some land in a cornfield, and we were building a house, and one afternoon, my contractor came to me and he said, tomorrow, you need to floor your attic. And so I got there the next day, and you know, it's really hot, and we have sheets of plywood that have to get up into the attic so that I can floor. And so he pushes them up to me. And I really understood that day, 2's far better than 1. Because I'm a skinny little boy, and I'd have never gotten things up there by myself. 2 is much better than 1. It's far better than 1. He says, 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. Verse 10, for if they fall, one will lift up his companion. You know, if you're on a ladder and you fall, it's good if there's 2 of you out there. Someone to help you up or call for help, right? 2 are better than 1. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Verse 11, again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm, but how can one be warm alone? I was reading this past week about some of these men in World War II. They would go and they would dig their foxholes out, and 2 or 3 men would get in a foxhole deep in the wintertime, snow everywhere. You know how they got warm? They huddled up to each other. You know, husbands, hey, if you're married, a little bit of snuggling to keep you warm, right? You don't ever tell your wife, get away, you're hot. Right? It'll just keep you warm. If 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm? Verse 12, though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him. Again, if you're married, you understand this principle. If you are married and just one of you is working on your marriage, you know, working to have a great marriage, it's not always so easy. If just one of you is working at it. Things can easily overtake you. But if 2 are working on the marriage, 2 can withstand. And then you add the third to your marriage, Jesus Christ, and look what happens. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. Again, Christians, we are always at our best. Always at our best when we stick together. And so, back to Acts chapter 1, here's these early Christians, the early church. They are all together. They are waiting. Jesus had ascended to heaven. They are missing him already, but they decided to stick together, and it was just a beautiful thing. There is nothing worse than something in church that divides us. You will find a lot written in Scripture, especially by Paul, that talks about how dangerous division in church is. We are better together. So Acts chapter 1, verse 13, again it says, "And when they had entered, they went into the upper room where they were staying Peter." So now we are getting into a list. And Peter was almost always first one on the list whenever they listed the apostles. Peter was a sanguine type of temperament, a sanguine type of personality. You know, he was the guy that would be the first to do something, the first to speak up. His name was usually the first, which indicates Peter is likely their leader. Peter is the leader of this group, and I want you to understand, and it's easy to understand here, he wasn't the only leader though. Sometimes we talk about Peter as being this leader of the church. He was far from the only leader. It's a lonely thing to lead all by yourself. But he wasn't the only leader. This was shared leadership. It was not a one-man show. Look at what it says. "And when they had entered, they went up into the upper room where they were staying. Peter, James, John, and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas the son of James." These were the leaders of the early church. This was an amazing thing. This was shared leadership. And that is the model all throughout the Bible. It was always presented to us as shared leadership. Then when you get to the New Testament and they start talking about the church and leadership in the church, it was very, very important that it was shared leadership, and it was also spiritual leadership, which always produced spiritual progress. The key was always spiritual leaders. And so the story of the church goes something like this. The apostles, they went out and they began preaching the gospel. And as they preach, people begin to respond to the preaching. And then people begin to get saved. And once people begin to get saved, they begin to gather together. And when they begin to gather together, it became perfectly clear that they needed leaders. They needed leadership. And you will read, and we will read, if we get that far into Acts, you will read how Paul and Silas, or Paul and Barnabas, they would go out and they would preach the gospel, and people would get saved, and they would start gathering together. And then Paul and Silas, they would go away, and then later they would come back. And the first thing they did when they came back was appoint elders. They put together leadership in the church so that the church could progress. It was the church being what the church was supposed to be. And a church being what the church is supposed to be will have spiritual shared leadership. It is people working together. It's a beautiful picture. Peter paints this, again, because he was one of the leaders. And 1 Peter chapter 5, and I want to show that to you real quick. Hold your place in Acts. We'll come back to that in just a few minutes. 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter being one of the leaders in the early church, learning so much, he began to write and share some of the leadership principles that he thought was important. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1, he says this, the elders. Now, the word elders in our English language usually translates to the word Presbyterian. It is a word that means spiritual maturity. And that word elder that we often use today and was also used in the Bible, we often use it to speak about someone who is elder in age or older in age. And of course you know this, and we talked about this before. Spiritual maturity does not mean you have to grow to a ripe old age to be spiritually mature. As a matter of fact, you can be 90 years old and have no spiritual maturity in you whatsoever. Or you could be really young and be a very spiritually mature person. So Peter says, the elders who are among you, I exhort or encourage, I who am a fellow elder. Peter simply telling them, I'm an elder with you. We all are in church leadership together. I who am a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed. So Peter's telling us, I'm a leader, you're a leader. Now, here's what leaders do. Verse 2, shepherd the flock of God which is among you. The responsibility of a church leader is to shepherd the flock. That word shepherd there, it means to tend to look after, to take care of, to feed. The responsibility of a spiritual leader is to take care of and to feed the flock. That's what they are supposed to do. It is spiritual leadership and shared leadership. Shepherd the flock of God which is among you. So, here's what that means. Whatever God has given you, whoever God has trusted you with, whether you are a teacher in Sunday school, a teacher in Vacation Bible School, whether you are a pastor, whether you are a deacon of the church, whatever it is, your responsibility is to look after them, to shepherd them, to teach them, to lead them spiritually. He says, shepherd the flock of God. Now, whose flock is it? God's flock. It's not our flock, it's God's flock. So we shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers. Now that word overseers in the 20th and the 21st century, it became known as someone who was an administrator, someone who was good at management, someone who was a good supervisor. But that's not at all what the word meant when Peter used it. That word overseer in the Greek meant to be aware of, to look diligently, at the surroundings, to look around and see what was around you. It was like a shepherd looking after his sheep. The shepherd of a sheep, he was constantly looking around the surroundings, and you know what he was usually looking for? A wolf. Because there are wolves out there looking to destroy their sheep. So an overseer, he was a protector. He was looking out for his sheep. So, Peter says, here's what spiritual leaders do. They shepherd the flock of God, which is among you, serving as overseers. We are protecting the flock that God has trusted us with, whoever God has trusted us with. Not by compulsion, but willingly, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly. And so, he says that you are leading not because somebody pressured you into leading. You know, that's not what we want. You're not leading because someone forces you to lead. You're not leading because you feel obligated to lead. You do it because it's your desire to serve God. You freely choose that responsibility of spiritual leadership, of serving God. Your motivation is, I love Jesus, and I'm going to serve Him and His church. Now, and I pray that you just love serving Jesus. It is such a wonderful thing, and it's not something to take lightly. It is a huge responsibility. And I want to show you just a small portion of that this morning. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 17. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 17. Here is some great instruction for us. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17, it says this: obey those who rule. Rule is the word authority. We've been given some authority by God to teach, to preach, to lead. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. We've already done that today, some of us. And but in my Sunday school class understands that. They're so wonderful. They are great. Ruler or rule means authority, leadership. It's spiritual leadership. It's shared leadership. And look at what he says. Obey those who rule over you and be submissive. Spiritual leaders, again, are overseers. They care about us. They care about our life. They're looking out for us. They're keeping an eye constantly on the surroundings. They're protecting the flock of God. It's one of the most important things that you do in life. And why is it so important? He tells us, look, for they watch out for your souls. They watch out for your souls. Spiritual leaders are looking out for the very souls of men and women, boys and girls, teenagers, children. They're looking out for your souls. Listen, there's a lot of important things you do in life. You know, you get married and you raise a family and you work hard for your children, you work hard for your wife, you work hard to build your life. Really, really important things. But there's nothing more important than watching out for souls. That is a tremendous, unbelievable responsibility that carries a lot of authority, the authority that comes from God. And it's such a wonderful, wonderful thing. I really don't know of anything more important than watching out for the souls of people. So, those of you who and all leaders, all good leaders are also good followers. Everyone. If you're not a good follower, you'll probably never make a good leader. But all of us, if you want to live a life pleasing to God, listen to what he says. Obey those who rule over you. That'll be pleasing to God. And be submissive, for they watch out for your soul. Spiritual leaders, they really care about people. They're watching over the flock of God. And look at what happens. As those who must give account. Better not take this lightly. Shared spiritual leadership is not something you take lightly. I'll be honest with you. It has always scared me. As a pastor, sometimes if I think about it too much, and you do need to think about it, but if I think about it too much, it scares me, because that means that every word I speak from this pulpit, I'll give an account for. Not only does it scare me, that's great motivation to study and to study hard. Because I'm looking out for the souls of people. And I'll give an account for that one day. And I take it very seriously, and I agonize over every sermon. It's just an amazing thing. Leadership in the church is spiritual leadership, and it's shared leadership and shared responsibility. There is never, ever, ever one person who can do everything. If you know one person who thinks they can do everything, watch out for them. Here's why. Church is a team. We stick together. We love one another. We work together. And it's amazing what happens when you do that. So he says, obey those who rule over you and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls as those who must give an account. See, God gives us the authority to teach and preach and lead, but we're accountable for that. We are accountable for that. So here's what we're to do. Every one of us who are in shared responsibility and shared leadership, who look over the flock here at Faulks Church Road, those of us who are spiritual leaders, we are to do that in a very spiritual way, because everything in the church is spiritual, whether you thought about it that way or not. And then the rest of us, and really all of us, we are to let those who serve in spiritual positions, look at what it says we are to do. Let them do so with joy. Let them do so with joy. And can I say this for my part? In the short time that I've been here at Faulks Baptist Church, for my part in the shared spiritual leadership, it has been a great joy. You have let me do my job with great joy. Look again at what it says. Let them do so with joy and not with grief. That simply says, don't make it hard on them. Don't make it difficult for them to lead. Don't be a burden to them, because there's nothing for you to gain from that. Absolutely nothing to gain. No advantage in that whatsoever. Obey those who rule over you and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls as those who must give an account. Let them do so with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable for you. Nothing to get out of being a burden to spiritual leaders. Shared spiritual leadership. It's all done in the name of Jesus and under the guidance of His Word. It's a beautiful, joyful thing. So now, back to Acts chapter 1, verse 13. Luke lists the 13 leaders of the church. And I'll read it to you once again. And when they had entered, they went into the upper room where they were staying. Peter, James, John, and Andrew, and Philip, and Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas, the son of James. These were the leaders of the early church. And I have just come to realize there's no way we're going to get through the rest of the verses today. Unless somebody brought lunch. Did anybody bring lunch? Okay. Here's what we'll do. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, and then we'll come back, because what I'm going to probably leave out today, it's really important, so we'll come back to it. I really have bitten off far more than I can chew today. But let me kind of summarize real quickly what's happening. I know it's getting close to time to leave. Here you have 11 apostles, and they are waiting on the Holy Spirit. During this time of waiting, Peter stands up, because Peter's a leader, and he says, there's 11 of us, and there should be 12 of us. And so he began to share that, and this is what we're going to miss today. He began to share this story of Judas, who betrayed Jesus, and how horrible it was. And he talks about the ugly, disgusting death of Judas. And he begins to share all that's going on. And he says, and he's talking from the book of Psalms, this is what we've got to do. And so, Will, if you would, let's go to verse 20, if you don't mind. There we go. Verse 20, here we go. Here's what Peter says, for it is written in the book of Psalms, let his dwelling place be desolate. This was a prophecy. So, talking about Judas and his house, and he says, let his dwelling place be desolate, and let no one live in it, and let another take his office. And so what they did, these 120 people got together to choose someone to replace Judas. And it had to be someone who had been with them the whole time that Jesus walked the earth. It had to be someone they were very familiar with. And so these 120 people, they got together somehow and they narrowed it down to 2 people. And I don't know if it was difficult to narrow it all the way down to 1 person, and they couldn't do it. I don't know how that worked out. But they narrowed it down to 2 people. And then they did something really, really strange. They got a couple of stones, and they did this on certain occasions. It just depended, on what they were choosing and how they were selecting something. But it was really kind of a strange process. But they got a couple of stones, and here's what they did with those stones. Let's go to verse 26. Sorry, y'all. Here we go. And they cast their lots, and the lot fell on Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles. So it's like they had these 2 stones, and I don't know exactly how they did it. Sometimes one stone was painted white, one was painted black, and they choose that way. Sometimes they would write their names on the stone somehow. They'd put them in a container and they would shake it, and the first stone would come out. That would be the choice. That's a likely way they did this. And so they shook the container. The name of Matthias falls out, and he was their choice for the 12th apostle. And I wish I really had more time to go into detail with all of that, because it's fascinating. And it's at first thought, you think, well, where's God in all that? Throwing dice or pulling throat or whatever. It is fascinating, and we'll come back to that sometime and look at that. But here's the point. Your church, you are in that process of choosing. You're choosing a lot of people. In a few weeks, you're going to choose a couple of more deacons. And it's a very important process. And then I think shortly after that, the nominating committee, they're getting together, and you're going to be choosing people to serve in your church. And then you're going to be choosing a new pastor. You have a lot of important choices to make decisions on real soon. I mean, and it's like happening fast. Summer is just flying by so fast. And so you want to be in prayer about it. I don't know of any more important decisions in life than what you are about to do. I try not to keep up with this because it makes me yell at the TV or whatever, but I can't help myself. I've been keeping up with some of the presidential candidates. Oh man, that'll make you cross-eyed, right? I mean, it is crazy, but it's an important decision. I don't know that what you're about to do is more important, because your choices have eternal effects. It's an amazing thing what we're doing. In the scheme of eternal things, you guys are doing something that is really, really important. These are not small things. these are important things because you're talking about shared spiritual leadership. You're talking about people who are leading and feeding and protecting the flock of God. So bathe it in prayer. Just cover it in prayer. Now, I realize there's probably 100 different ways that you can apply these words that we've heard today to your life. But in the immediate future, we're talking about making choices for your church. And so that's a really, really important time. So, would you stand with me today? And let me ask you a question. Would you be willing to come and pray for your church as it's going through this time of transition and choosing all these different leaders? Would you even be willing to come today and pray and ask God, what will my part be in that? How do you want me to serve? How do you want me to be part of this shared spiritual leadership of our church? Maybe you're even here today and you're not a member of Faulks Baptist Church and you've come to realize what I've come to realize. These are fabulous people. Maybe you want to come and join our church. We'd love to have you. Maybe today you're a teenager here. We have teenagers here. Maybe today, maybe you have thought about, when I was talking about obeying your leaders, maybe you thought about that. And maybe you just want to ask God to help you obey them because they are looking out for your souls. Same thing for your children. Obey your leaders. You have great leaders here. Obey them because they're looking out for your soul. Make it a joy for them to serve you. Most importantly today, however God has spoken to you, you respond to Him as we sing.